Now let's turn our attention to microstructural features within Proverbs 2. As we do so, we'll be able to sense the continuity of message that builds from the beginning to the end of this powerful poem. As we focus on section 1, that is verses 1 through 4, we can fairly quickly detect a dynamic progression. The sequence of verbs portraying how the youth should pursue wisdom forms a dynamic, intensifying progression. First, he should grasp the instructions as though they are personified in a nearby friend whose hand can be easily clasped. Second, in verse 2, he should listen intently for wisdom. In this scenario, we can imagine that Lady Wisdom is not so near as in verse 1, but if the youth listens carefully, he will easily locate her from the rustling sound of her receding footsteps. At the third stage, the search escalates to hollering after wisdom, as though Lady Wisdom is now receding in the distance far enough away that her footfalls are no longer audible as they were in verse 2. In the fourth stage, Lady Wisdom is out of earshot, so that calling after her yields no response. In this fourth scenario, the youth must show the resolve of a miner who cannot rely on mute metals to voice their location, but must discover them by sheer determination, chiseling away in hidden stony shafts in hopes of uncovering something of immense worth. That is the dynamic progression that builds from verse to verse through section 1, mapping out the escalating intensity and determination the youth must show if he's serious about pursuing wisdom. The next structural feature involves a positive-negative contrast of rewards and protections that appear in blocks 2A and 2B. Block 2A spans verses 5 through 11, and then block 2B spans verses 12 through 19. Those valuable results that follow after a pursuit of wisdom consist of two pairs. The first pair that the sage introduces is positive, and so we are labeling them here rewards. You can see that indicated in the title of block 2A, two rewards spanning verses 5 through 11. The initial reward instills reverence, and that subportion spans 5 through 8. The latter reward involves the cultivation of moral character, and that spans 9 through 11. Those then are the first pair, reverence and the cultivation of moral character. The second pair of results, while remaining desirable, is cast in a negative light. Here, the youth is promised protection from harmful figures. On the one hand, from the man lacking moral character, verses 12 through 15, and on the second hand, from the woman who is misaligned, out of alignment with the divine, and that's in verses 16 through 19. So these constitute the positive-negative contrast of rewards, the positive, and protections, the negative, that show up in blocks 2A and 2B. The next microstructural feature is a chiastic correlation of rewards and protections. Now we're still operating in blocks 2A and 2B, the overall span of 5 through 19. It's instructive, I think, to note that among the total of 4 valuable results, that is 2 positive and 2 negative, the outer elements, the first positive and the last negative, those are places where the divine is mentioned. Verses 5, also verse 6 of the positive, which read, "Then you will grasp the fear of the Lord, and knowledge of God you will find." Verse 6, For it is the Lord who can grant wisdom, and from his mouth he can grant knowledge and understanding. And then verse 17, within the second negative benefit, mentions the divine. That second negative benefit spans 16 through 19. Notice the reference to the divine in verse 17. Protection or rescue is offered from one who abandons the companion of her youth and has forgotten the covenant with her God. So the outer elements of the four benefits, rewards, and protections, the outer ones refer to the divine. And now notice the inner of those four. That would be elements second reward and first protection. Those inner elements concentrate on relationships in the human community rather than the vertical relationship of human to divine. So this occurs in the second positive element, the reward, that's verses 9 through 11, and the first negative, that is protection, in verses 12 to 15. This develops then a chiastic pattern, lining up the four in order: mention of divine in the first reward, mention of human relationships in the second reward, mention of human relationships in the first negative protection, and then back to the divine relationship in the second negative protection. Now let's turn our attention to those elements that are parallel when we compare the first reward, that is Unit 2A1, verses 5 through 8, alongside the ensuing second reward, Unit 2A2, verses 9 through 11. Each of the rewards comprising Units 2A1 and 2 begin with the same phrase, "Then you will grasp." You will find that in verse 5a and again in 9a. In those verses, the sage posits a major principle encapsulating their respective rewards. So 2 verses, 2 major principles. In the first, attaining an attitude of reverence appears as the premier reward. That's very important. Verse 5. And second, cultivating community relationships marked by moral character comprises then the second principle, the second reward, verse 9. Let's hear those. Verse 5. Then you will grasp the fear of the Lord, and knowledge of God you will find. Verse 9. Then you will grasp equity, fair decision, and integrity, every good track. By track is meant a smaller pathway of progress through life. Now, in each of these 2 respective units, the second verse will present an explanation for the principle that was just articulated in the respective first verses. The reason, for example, that the pursuit of wisdom led to the reward of reverence, that's the principle in verse 5, that owes to the fact that tracing wisdom diligently to its source inevitably leads one to the Lord, because he is the giver of wisdom. Notice how verse 6 points this out. For it is the Lord who can grant wisdom. From his mouth he can grant knowledge and understanding. The reason that a wisdom pursuit led to moral community relationships, and now we're referring to the principle in verse 9, the reason it led to moral community relationships owes to the fact that wisdom has been permitted by the youth to gain deep access, as deep as the level of his motives. Verse 10a, for wisdom will enter your motives. We could appropriately paraphrase this. Wisdom will penetrate even as far as the things that make you determined to do one decision or another, the things that make you choose one preference over another. It will percolate that deep into your person. Incidentally, a sidelight on that may be appropriate. The word for motives here is lave, customarily translated heart. Often in wisdom literature it should be translated mind, because those two share the same lexeme in Hebrew. But increasingly it's becoming evident that it's not simply mind as the organ of intellectual reasoning, but also motives, the push behind it. This is an appropriate rendition often for what we otherwise would render heart or mind. And so it's rendered motives here. Incidentally, part of the rationale supporting translating lave as motives in 10a is the fact that it runs parallel to the word appetites in 10b. When we think about how appetites operate, they are desires that draw us. Motives run on that same sort of frequency. Appetites, in case you're checking other versions, appetites might be translated one's soul. The Hebrew there is nephesh. But as we become more closely acquainted with the etymology of this word, it has to do with one's throat anatomically, one's neck, and that's the area of appetite or longing within a person. Continuing then with this second phase in the parallel sequencing, verse 10, wisdom's counsel for this individual does not merely adorn as a superficial cosmetic, but has won a place in the youth's innate appetites, as we've just said in verse 10b. Having gained so deep a degree of influence, it naturally follows that the wisdom disciple would display moral character in his or her community relationships. The third verse of each unit lists consequences that benefit one who embraces the principle found at the head of those respective units. Thus, a person who embraces the principle of revering the Lord, that we saw in verse 5, may expect this consequence. Verse 7, gaining access to stores of success and shielding supplied by the Lord. In the next unit, a person who embraces the principle of moral rectitude, and that we saw in verse 9, may expect a similar consequence of protection, which is articulated in verse 11. As you're following along, you may have observed that Unit 2A1 spans 4 verses, while 2A2 spans only 3. In the case of 2A1, that is 5 through 8, the consequence begun in verse 7 that we've just acknowledged generously spills over into verse 8 as well, implying that the benefits afforded by reverence, that's the principle governing verses 5 through 8, the benefits afforded by reverence are especially ample. In fact, the consequence statement found in the third verse of 2A2, that is verse 11, that second consequence statement is more closely linked to verse 8 than it is to verse 7. Notice both verses 8 and 11 convey the specific benefits preserve and guard, albeit chiastically inverted in their order. So to summarize, in this microstructure we've seen that there are parallel elements in the first and second rewards. That is Unit 2A1 and 2A2. They cycle through the same 3: principle, explanation, and consequences. But in the first unit, the consequences are double long, spanning verses 7 and 8, which may indicate that the fear of the Lord, the governing principle in verse 5, was especially premier and beneficial in the sage's understanding. Our study of Proverbs 2 will continue in the next lecture.